All right, everybody, I think we're going to get started. Welcome back to the afternoon sessions of our conference on strengthening social cohesion. I think
Recording in progress.
We're pretty excited to have a slightly smaller group this afternoon, both online and in person. And I think that speaks to what we're hoping the tone of the afternoon will be, which will be a bit more informal exchanges, more time for Q&A. We're really looking forward to that. We have two panels this afternoon. One is on measurement and one is on evidence. And before jumping into those, a couple of housekeeping rules to remind you all of. If you could, when you are not speaking, if you're participating online, please be on mute. A reminder that all sessions are going to be recorded. And then we'll also have opportunities in the afternoon as well for Q&A, so please continue to put your comments in the Q&A section online. And then we're going to ask that all panelists in the afternoon keep your video on throughout the duration of the panel. It makes it much easier from a Zoom tech perspective to spotlight you so that the other people in the room can see you. And yeah, so if you would like to ask a question in the room in the afternoon, you will be prompted to at various points during the panel, so please raise your hand and please use the microphones. And so without further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our session for the afternoon on the Frontiers of Social Cohesion Measurement. And the facilitator for this session is David Connolly, who is the Director of Learning, Research, and Evaluation. I got the order of those mixed up at the United States Institute for Peace. So, David.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Nessa. We're actually changing the name of my team, so maybe we'll go with your reordering. It sounds good. Well, welcome back, and it's great to be here. As Nessa said, we've got a very interesting panel of expert speakers. The focus of today's session is to consider ongoing strategies and approaches for strengthening how we measure social cohesion. And with our expert speakers, and I think Pamina online, we're going to begin by taking stock of progress, looking at peace building more broadly. And then the rest of the speakers are going to address localization within social cohesion. And they're going to look at different aspects of that. So looking at indicators for localization, how do we build indicators, how do we work with local communities, for example, but also looking at the trade-offs, localization versus cross-country comparison, for example. So localization will definitely be a common topic for all our speakers today. But to begin, we're going to, as I say, look more broadly at peace building. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Jessica.
Would you like us to stay here or come to the podium? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today and for this lovely panel of what I'm certain is going to be a really engaging conversation. As David said, I really wanted to step back for a moment. I work more broadly across measurement in the peacebuilding field, not exclusively with social cohesion. So I wanted to set kind of the stage a little bit on the progress we've made to date and some potential pathways forward. And then I know my colleagues up here will be speaking very concretely about some of their efforts, and Pamina as well online. So just to kind of start off, when I first read the session, a couple of thoughts that kind of struck me in terms of some of the progress made. You know, one, I would argue that we really have made great progress towards measurement when it comes to peace building. When I joined the Alliance for Peacebuilding a little over 5 years ago, I can remember the very first PeaceCon that I attended, we were hosting a Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium session, and there was such vitriol in the audience around the concept of measurement. You can't measure this, let alone you should not measure this. So really reflecting upon, and this is purely anecdotal and purely qualitative, but from that moment to now, the shift in the field towards both an acceptance of measurement, a desire to measure, and a reflection on what measurement means for ourselves, for the field, for program participants, et cetera. So I think that that's a really important note to kind of start us off on. A couple of the key areas, when again, that I kind of reflected upon when posed this question for the panel, you know, for me, looking at this, we had from 2011 onward the Peacebuilding Evaluation Consortium that was started with funding from the Carnegie Corporation in New York, that was joined by the Alliance for Peacebuilding, Mercy Corps, Search for Common Ground, as well as CDA, collaborative projects, many of whom are some of the founding members are actually here and participated in, that worked for over 10 years to kind of strengthen these concepts around both evaluation and measurement. And then, you know, this was a massive field-wide effort. And Beyond that, though, we've seen some other huge projects. USIP's Impact Project. I remember AEA, I think 2018 maybe, or 19, working with some of USIP's colleagues from the Initiative to Measure Peace and Conflict Outcomes and their work in Colombia, and looking at how great they had moved towards collecting various data and creating that and presenting that onward to, I know we're going to hear from Pamina, but the Everyday Peacebuilding Indicators Project and the progress that they have made towards the concept of measurement, particularly at a localized level. But then also things like CRS's Social Cohesion Indicators Bank, which I'm sure I see Nell here that we spoke about earlier today, but really trying to solidify both vertical and horizontal social cohesion, different concepts that can reflect on, different dimensions of society and how we measure that, and trying to get us closer towards what measurement of social cohesion really looks like. And then, from my own work and some of my colleagues who are here and others who have participated in it, the Irene Peacebuilding database that we released in 2020, I'm excited to say that we'll actually be releasing a new iteration, hopefully at PeaceCon 2023, which I promise to say, if you don't know, is going to be May 3rd, 4th, and 5th here in DC. But we'll be releasing, I think what's relevant here is to expand that over 10,000 indicators, and importantly, the inclusion of a digital database that allows for participatory inclusion of indicators that we're not finding in the published database. So I think that's really important when we consider where we started, even in my shorter stay of the field, too. I think some great examples we're going to see here from different individuals across the World Bank, IRC, of course, Everyday Peacebuilding Indicators, and more. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for taking stock and outlining that with such clarity, and also for keeping to time. Much appreciated. So you mentioned EPI, Everyday Peace Indicators, and as we now step into this topic, a little bit more focused on localization, of course, it's crucial that we bring into this discussion what the EPI has given to this discourse. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our other panelist who's joining us online, as you can see, Pamina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Great to see you all. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. It would be wonderful to be there, but unfortunately it wasn't possible this time. So hopefully we'll do this again soon. All right, so I'm going to give a quick overview of EPI and then talk a little bit about some research that we've been doing comparing expert-driven indicators with community-driven indicators. So EPI is Everyday Peace Indicators. It's a participatory research methodology. And we generate indicators with communities or individual villages and neighborhoods worldwide to co-create metrics of a variety of concepts. So we work on peace, social cohesion, coexistence, reconciliation, justice, well-being, other concepts as well. Really, in essence, concepts that are difficult to define and therefore difficult to measure. And we co-create those metrics with communities to understand the everyday lived experiences of those communities. And in this way, we include everyday people in the decision-making processes behind the measurement tools that we create. So you can do this for surveys, indexes, barometers, whatever kind of measurement tool you're creating. There are decisions that need to be made behind those measurement tools. And instead of relying only on experts, we include communities in that decision-making process. And that allows us to be able to measure and also understand better concepts like social cohesion. So with this research methodology, we can do a variety of things, like we can interrogate theory if we're working on academic projects, but we can also evaluate projects through mixed methods research, but also by using experimental designs. And we can also provide information on the priorities of everyday people in context experiencing violence and conflict by analyzing their everyday indicators through coding, weighting, and descriptive statistics. So I recently finished a paper with a colleague of mine at Brandeis. His name is Dr. Peter Dixon. He works with me on a lot of everyday peace indicators projects. We wrote this paper based on some research that we did from a project funded by the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I thought this would be of interest to this group because in the paper we compare expert-driven barometers of reconciliation in Colombia with everyday peace indicators, which we term as being representative of community-driven metrics. And those everyday peace indicators that we used in this analysis were collected in 14 villages in 2 regions in Colombia. For those of you familiar with Colombia, that's Northern Cauca and Antioquia. And what we found was really striking. Comparing these 3 barometers demonstrates clearly how barometers and indexes developed for policymaking purposes that are often seen as objective measurement tools because they're created by experts and outsiders, are themselves embedded in social networks and professional fields whose internal logics and incentives influence what ultimately is deemed worthy of measurement. These agendas come out clearly when we directly compare the everyday indicators with these expert-driven metrics. Now, this is something that is, maybe intuitive, but not something that we've been able to empirically prove or demonstrate. So by directly comparing these indicators, the everyday indicators, with expert-driven metrics, we're able to demonstrate how these logics are embedded in these measurement tools. We also show how expert-led measurement efforts lack the same breadth and context specificity of community-driven metrics, which is a key point for concepts of complexity like reconciliation or social cohesion. Community-driven measurement systems are naturally broader, and they allow for multiple issues to be included and prioritized, and demonstrate that priorities related to measurement, especially when it comes to these difficult to define concepts, are very context specific, allowing for only minimal universality across contexts, which I know may be controversial in this room. We draw on our analysis to argue that government agencies and international organizations are often overly siloed and protective of their mandates to effectively address the everyday needs of localization and social cohesion in conflict-affected settings. So community-driven approaches rather show that if we want to achieve goals related to social cohesion and peace, international aid to conflict settings should be the purvey of multiple institutions and actors rather than just a particular professional field like security or human rights or economic development. In conclusion, we really need to keep in mind the goals of measurement and why we're measuring when we embark on efforts to measure social cohesion. Transparency about the motivations behind the measurement of concepts like social cohesion is key. And we need to ask and also explain to our audiences whether we are, for example, measuring to set agendas, or whether we are trying to demonstrate that we are an authority in the field we are measuring, and we demonstrate that through measuring, or whether we are trying to ensure that everyone who is being measured is progressing toward a common goal, or whether we are measuring to procure funding, or whether we are measuring because we truly want to know if we have made progress in developing social cohesion in a society or in a community. And we can see that community-driven measurement provides a roadmap to guide international aid actors and governments to fund and implement programs that respond to the latter question about measuring progress, and that are most responsive to local needs. So these community-driven measures really respond to the local needs and also are able to give us more information about measuring real progress towards reconciliation or social cohesion, coexistence. So if we care to measure in order to understand social cohesion better in a context, we should do this using community-driven metrics. Thank you.
Thanks, Pamina, for introducing EPI and for sharing your recent research and highlighting, amongst many things, the importance of being very clear on the motivations for measurement. So in a previous, earlier on today, can't remember which panel, somebody, I think it was Kristen, highlighted the need for more sophisticated approaches to measuring. Of course, this is what our panel is here for today. But with that, I'm going to turn now to Katja to share some recent research findings. Okay, great.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. So let me first start with explaining why at the IRC we are interested in localizing measurement and definition of social cohesion. So for us, it comes from, I guess, three motivations or rationales. One is, a general organizational commitment to localization, not just of measurement, but also of program design, right? With the idea that, we obviously want to promote voices of people that are directly affected by crisis and conflict, and really support programming that is client-driven and client-centered. Then our programming is structured, or I guess geared towards the achievement of outcomes in 5 outcome areas, from health, education, safety, economic empowerment, and governance or power. And it's based on, let's say, global or universal theories of change, which are evidence-based. But whenever we approach a program or enter a context or work in a specific context, those theories of change, of course, have to be adapted to the local context to really inform programming. And finally, the reason, and that this, builds on or responds directly to what Pamina was just saying, is that obviously, in order for us to be effective in our programming, we really have to understand local dynamics, and part of this is understanding how social cohesion is understood and can be improved locally. So that's where we come from to this discussion. And so we recently started piloting what we refer to as the Community Peace and Development Framework, which is certainly inspired by EPI, so the Everyday Peace Indicators methodology, as well as other participatory approaches, such as community scorecards, for example. And so it doesn't only measure social cohesion, rather social cohesion is one of the dimensions or domains that we look at in our peace building interventions, right? So in addition, we're looking at other governance and development relevant outcomes, such as social accountability, availability of services, responsiveness of services, equality, inclusion, availability for economic opportunities, and the like. And so when it comes to measuring social cohesion specifically, we look at both the horizontal and the vertical dimension of it, so horizontal, inter, and intracommunal dynamics, right? And again, coming from a practitioner's perspective, this tool is quite simple because it's meant for practitioners to use in the field, right? So it's not, is it systematic? Yes. Does it follow methodology and a process that can be replicated? Yes. Is it as rigorous as an experimental approach? Not necessarily. But what it does, it really allows our country teams to evaluate the situation on the ground, to provide perhaps a baseline, establishing baseline scores across the different dimensions that I mentioned. And importantly, perhaps most importantly for our operations, is that by scoring these different dimensions, it highlights which ones are low, right? And those are like important areas of operation. And I guess important to mention is also that the definition of these local measures and the scoring of the local measures is done by community members themselves, right? So it's one of the approaches that combines, I guess, these universal domains or dimensions, as well as a local understanding of those, right? So in addition to just quickly presenting this approach that we're currently piloting in South Sudan, and I think we'll soon start implementing also in Iraq and Somalia, I just wanted to offer a couple of additional reflections coming from recent research, where we looked at cities as destination areas of migration in fragile contexts and displacement, obviously, and we looked at how displacement into cities affects dynamics, conflict dynamics between host and displaced communities, particularly around how displacement into cities puts additional pressure on natural resources, particularly land and water. And so we were interested in seeing how those dynamics affect the relationship between the two groups. And we conducted this study both in two different cities, intermediary cities, in Bukavu and in Maiduguri. And what we found, interestingly, is that in neither of those contexts, this additional pressure on resources really led to violence, intergroup-based violence, right? Certainly, there were tensions, but it did not escalate. And respondents mentioned that it might be because of prolonged displacement, so different people had the chance to establish relationships. But importantly, what we saw in both contexts is that, and this speaks to the relationship between vertical and horizontal social cohesion, is that in both contexts there were local leaders who were trusted by the communities, who were willing and able to address, local conflicts, both in terms of prevention and then mitigation or management when those conflicts were to arise. And another point that I wanted to mention, again, that came out of this research, and I thought it's quite interesting in terms of how contextual factors might affect social cohesion and other conflict dynamics, is that the nature of displacement into cities seems to have affected different dimensions of social cohesion. So, for example, in Maiduguri, this displacement being a reflection of different types of conflicts, right? In Maiduguri, for example, what we saw is that the displacement was sudden, and it was a reflection of the rising of the Boko Haram insurgency, right? And people seem to really problematize displacement, right? As a what affected the strain and the additional pressure on resources. In Bukavu, in DRC, which saw a different nature of conflict, where there's been conflict or tensions or instability for, let's say, 25 years at this point, and there's this constant influx of rural populations into cities. People tended to focus more on urban planning and weaknesses in urban governance or local governance, and how that affected the conflict dynamics and external resources. And we could see there was strain in the relationship between the communities and the authorities. So these are just some of the considerations that I wanted to mention about contextual factors that might affect measurement of social cohesion. And just a final point, if I may. No, maybe let's leave it for a discussion later on. I don't want to be too long. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So interesting to hear about the comparison of those two cities in your recent research, and introducing this thematic area of water in particular, water and climate, or
water and land, right? So we looked at both resource in our areas, it was quite tricky because the conflict dynamics around these resources are obviously different. But when it comes to managing conflict, what really was important is that having local leaders that are trusted was really a key in the community's ability to address some of the conflicts, right? And again, what was also really important was to know that simple pressure on resources or having different groups of people doesn't necessarily lead to conflict. It's not a simple dynamic. What seemed key really is local governance, right? And again, that's not surprising, and we're obviously not the first ones to be talking about this. But I think what is the novelty is to explore these dynamics in urban areas in fragile contexts.
Great, thanks again. So let's explore again. We set up front localization, a core theme for our panel, and I'm going to turn to Shana, okay. 50% chance of getting it right, so Shana. Well, you're going to tell us, but I'm particularly interested in the sort of trade-off between localization and the generalizability of findings. So over to you, and then our last speaker will focus on indicators. But before that, over to Shana.
Hi, thanks everyone. So I'm Shana Warren. I'm a research scientist at IPA. IPA is known for conducting impact evaluations, but we do a lot of other descriptive work and are moving into more complex contexts, in particular fragile contexts, in the purview of our peace and recovery team. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about sort of big picture measurement of social cohesion. So as we've seen, we've come a long, throughout the day today, we've come a long way from sort of the ad hoc measurement to the beginnings of developments of frameworks and indicators that are more common and more likely shared across organizations. Though if you look in sort of published academic literature, there does still seem to be an emphasis on novel measures, which may make comparison notably more challenging. So that's the first point. Second of all, we've also come a long way in terms of identifying what the concept of social cohesion might mean and having more common understandings. I think there's still a long way to go. As Pamina was pointing out, there are perhaps, in fact, frequently differences of opinion about what the most important factors are in social cohesion. But we are moving towards, I think, a more clear definition of the concept. And I focus on this because it's very difficult to measure something if you're not sure what it is that you're looking for in the first place. And very hard to agree on a common set of indicators if you're not sure what you're trying to be indicating. Okay. So some of the challenges that I wanted to highlight I'll start with the challenges and then I'll go to the good part, in measurement of social cohesion is that, first of all, we've often found a focus on short-term impacts. Many, many studies measure impacts within, 24 hours or maybe a week. And then the intention is to think about like societal change. Okay? We are also often relying on self-reported data. In many cases, exposure to researchers and to a lot of our programs lets people know what the expected answer might be. So that is another challenge, and we've had to become more creative with indicators over time. We also have many challenges with the validation of indicators. Just because something worked really well in one context does not mean it will work as well elsewhere. Understandings we heard earlier about sharing of food, for example, might be very different. Did you share food or did you sell it? So those I would like to highlight. But if you go too bespoke, suddenly things are not comparable. So this is a big trade-off. Particularly when designing a new program, you might want to know, well, how can I compare, I need a program in this location to address this challenge. How was it addressed elsewhere, and which of these do I think is more effective? When they're measured in very different ways, it can be difficult to make that assessment. We've also had a lot of indices. We like to throw things into indices, often because we have many questions. We're not quite sure what to do. We throw them all in an index. Hope for the best. I'm going to stand here and advocate for things like psychometric testing and validation of an index to make sure that you're measuring one construct and not many, where feasible. And then, as others have highlighted, we need to think about the whole causal chain. Before you don't want to design an indicator with no variation, or where you already knew everything before you started the project, because it was not testing your causal chain and where you thought things should move. Okay. Another point that's been highlighted today is that social cohesion might not always be a good thing, and there is increasing focus, I think, now on considering potentially negative impacts, social cohesion for bad, particularly in terms of like bonding ties in conflict contexts. And finally, something that everybody wants more of, but has been very difficult, is longer-term impacts. Right? We would love to know what happens longer term. It is expensive to track, particularly in fragile contexts with highly mobile populations who may or may not have access to cell phones, whose family networks may be disrupted. And then we also want to think about spillovers. But if it's hard to track the initial study participants, it's even harder to track more distant affected family members or community members. And then if you think about impacts that might happen through social networks and social media, the distance could be really great about who you should be looking for spillover effects. This goes back to the causal chain point. If you really trace this out, you might do better at identifying where you want to look for spillover effects, where you could reasonably expect to find them, because long-term follow-up is expensive, and looking at spillover effects also is expensive and time-consuming, and you want to make sure that it's a worthwhile endeavor. On the plus side, other direction. We are doing so much better as we move away from just attitudes and self-reports towards behavioral measures, towards asking people about a scenario that fits local context and how they might respond. We saw some examples of that earlier. We've also gotten a lot better at tracking highly mobile populations. The communications technology is moving quickly. I know that in many contexts, you can really reach highly mobile populations. For example, Venezuelan migrants in Colombia are much more easily reached via remote methods that are much less expensive. So these things are changing, and we are developing skills in using them. Let's see, the last thing I wanted to mention was that we have to consider whether we want attitude measures, theoretical behavioral measures, behavior in the real world. All of these things are important, but they might be important for different aspects of your theory of change. There is increasing evidence that it is not attitudes shift and then behavior, but maybe behaviors shift, and observing your own and the behavior of others repeatedly could lead to an attitude change. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about how people have measured these things and how they might measure them in the future.
Thanks so much. I mean, yeah, you've just really laid out an agenda for discussion there, and we'll try and get to some of that. For our last set of remarks, over to Benedetta.
Thank you. I'm Benedetta Lerva. I work at the Development Impact Evaluation Department here at the bank, and thank you so much for all of your remarks. And I'd like to discuss some of DIME and non-DIME work that hopefully maybe speaks to some of the points that you just made, Shana. There, I would maybe start by saying that in program design, social cohesion often is treated as something that sort of will occur naturally or automatically once that some programmatic targets are reached or once some outcomes have improved. But now we know we have enough evidence to say that that's not the case. So if we want to improve social cohesion, we need to understand specifically, of course, and here we've heard many examples of that, what it means, and then also what the challenges are given the local context, and build interventions around this. And then on these means, so the first reflection that I start with is that measurement isn't something that happens after a program has taken place, but it's something that happens before the program takes place, and something that should be baked into the design of the program and the program and the research that we are carrying out. So a few of the examples of social cohesion measurement that we've adopted at DIME. So in recent work on Niger, we were interested in evaluating the impact of a multifaceted program for poverty graduation targeted to women. So this program, we tested alternative packages of interventions that we could deliver for this poverty graduation. And 2 of the 3 interventions we studied included a psychosocial component. So it was super interesting to look at what happens on the psychosocial dimensions. So we designed, tested, and collected in the field a wide array of indicators that we grouped into indices. And the 6 indices that we came up with were financial support index, social support index, a social standing, standing of the beneficiary in society index, social norms index, a social cohesion and community closeness index, and a collective action index. Now, and also relating to what has been said, all of these indices include elements that make it connected to different aspects of social capital, specifically maybe bonding and bridging social capital in particular. So what's maybe more interesting for today is, and that maybe adds to the learnings of today, is that we were able to measure all of these indices in 2 different times. So first in 6 months. So let's say short, I would deem that like short term, but maybe, compared to the 24 hours, it already looks much longer. And 18 months that I would call medium term. And so if we concentrate today on the social cohesion and community closeness index that appears more relevant for the discussion of today, that's composed by nine indicators, such as how many villagers the woman trusts, whether women can count on help of other women in their community, whether they have enemies in the village, whether there have been tensions in the community in the past 6 months, and others. And what maybe you're interested in hearing is that we observe that the indices sort of already move within 6 months, which is great, when the intervention includes a psychosocial component. And we observe that the impacts are sustained in the long run, so like once that we measure at 18 months. We either observe that impacts are sort of increasing. If we already observe an impact in the 6 months, we observe that's on an increasing trend, or we observe that it's sort of like it stabilizes. One last thing that maybe it's important to note in the interest of time also is that here the key word for us was also sample size. The impacts, maybe in absolute term that we observe, are exist. They are not huge, and so we definitely do need a sample size that allows us for the quantitative measurements of this. And in the case of this study here, if you're interested, we have about 4,000 research participants in Niger. So. We are also measuring a subset of these same indices in related work on resilience, which sort of looks at how timing, cash transfers affects resilience to shocks. In a few countries, so Rwanda, South Sudan, Niger, and Mali include social cohesion indices. And for this study, we piloted extensively, how to convey the questions across cultures and across languages, and train enumerators accordingly. So we developed something. We also developed some hand gestures that we standardize across enumerators to deliver sort of complex context in an intuitive way. So, as an example, when we ask, how close do you feel to your community? Then enumerators is supposed to, explain, join in their hands that, I feel integrated versus I feel like independent. So all of these little tricks, maybe it's not the best word to describe it, but they would really allow to like convey the meaning intuitively. Really, we found that they really helped the respondents. And so, thus far we've discussed survey measures. There's a lot of innovation potentially in non-survey measures. And here, maybe a couple of examples just in the interest of time that I've seen that were very interesting. In recent work by Abiyarimana and co-authors, they sort of gave a task to a respondent where they had to find someone that belongs from a different ethnicity. They had 24 hours and they had a monetary reward for that. That tells you, how much people have connected with each other across ethnic lines. Or another interesting measuring tool that has gained traction is the implicit association test, so that measures implicit bias that people have against other people outside their group. But also, I want to keep stressing the importance of high-frequency measurement and mixed method approaches that absolutely should inform our work on this. And then, just as a concluding thought, for the work that we've done, we've observed that, any theoretically inspired reference survey module would definitely be helpful to advance the research and the cross-comparability of these measures. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Benedetta. It was good to get into the more technical aspects of this, and of course, not the only speaker. First of all, huge thanks to our panel speakers for sharing the research and insights. we have time. It's good. Time for questions and discussion. Just a quick check there. If you don't mind, I have 2 or 3 questions. I'll just ask one. As my title suggests, I'm particularly interested in learning, not just the evaluation and the research. So my question to each of you is, to all of you in the panel is, given, clearly given the sort of cutting edge nature of your research, both technical and in terms of strategy and approach, I'm really curious, I mean, how have you learned over the years? I know you're all still, in your careers, right? You're not getting towards the end of your careers, but at this stage in your career, how have you learned, and how important has learning been important to getting you to where you are now in terms of your research, both the technical and otherwise? And so that's kind of a nice, warm, fuzzy question. But I'm very interested, and then my second part question is, which is less positive, which is given the immense challenges, especially for, I'll use the term peace building, decreasing funding, increases in conflict, a shift to interstate tensions, strategic rivalry, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Given all these challenges, immense challenges, how can we improve upon learning? And obviously this gathering today is an important step, but how can we use learning to better equip us to try and face some of these very complex challenges when it comes to measuring social cohesion? So the first one, nice one, fuzzy. How do you learn? How important is learning for you? Second one, how can we better use learning? Or how are we using learning to try and help us address these challenges? Anyone like to go first? Jessica, you were looking straight at me, so.
It's my problem for making eye contact. In terms of your first question, how have I learned, or how has that helped me in my research? 2 thoughts that came to mind just from the speakers, and then when you asked that individual question, I can say one, Shana, when you were speaking, one of the things I really learned through doing the Irene Peacebuilding database, but also my continuous research on indicators and measurement in the peacebuilding field, we are not as novel as we'd like to think we are, and there is massive replication on what these concepts mean. We just kind of whisper it behind closed doors, mainly for funding issues or other things. We don't have a large enough sample size, we don't have a large enough, broad enough mission, whatever it may be. So I think one thing is just recognizing that we're not so special. So I think being able to share more and be more transparent in those aspects is really helpful to us. I think in terms of the other question of how I've learned is certainly, and again, this is one of those things maybe we don't share from our time in the field or our work, is all the times that I failed at trying to convince something or make something work. And I will, even though we are in the World Bank, I'll say from my long ago World Bank days doing an impact evaluation in Malawi, I can still remember doing an index on psychological care where I was trying to explain to enumerators what the question, "I often feel blue," means, to get them to collect data on this concept. And I just remember sitting there and I was thinking, as you're like talking, Benedetta, about hand movements or how I could not translate that, even in a predominantly British and English-speaking country. So, I mean, the failure of trying to make things fit that just don't fit, I think that that's been a really big learning curve for me as well. And even if you feel like you have that perfect measure, understanding, I think, Pamina, some of what you were speaking about, all of the biases and experiences I bring to creating that measure and why it resonates with me and maybe doesn't with others. So I think those have been big areas for learning that have helped me. In terms of challenges or how we can improve learning, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a huge open source fan, and I think that one of our big problems is we do hide a lot of these things either behind our fake paywalls in terms of funding or in the fact that it wasn't perfect, so we don't want to share it. So as a result, we kind of kick all of ourselves in the foot there by not being able to have open discussions. So I really do think that opportunities like this, opportunities like all of the different individuals here and the work that they're doing, we not only need to do a better job at communicating with each other, but we also have to invest our time, and this is something I would say, I know none of us have any time, let me be clear there, but I can't tell you the last time I looked at the World Bank's database for recent evaluations and read them, and that's an important part that I also have to take on me, or IPA or Mercy Corps or IRC. We have those responsibilities to both share as well as to educate ourselves.
Thanks so much for your candid approach to that question as well. Other panelists, any immediate thoughts to this question?
So building on what you said, I loved your point about sharing and open data, and I believe there has been substantial progress done in this aspect along two lines. So like first has been the fact that like in the scientific domain, replication occupies a larger and larger space. So the fact that once that a journal article is published, then the data should be anonymized and attached to that, and the code should be published as that everybody in the world can replicate that. That's a major step forward that we've done. And then relatedly also the availability of the instruments. And in the work that I mentioned in Niger, the paper is published in Nature, and there, if you open the paper, then there are links that will bring you to where, what the component of everything is and how that was measured. So that's like super key also, because that way we can build on each other's work in terms that is like very, field-based, like the instrument, the questions that we've asked the respondents. I found that it's been definitely super important. And another element that I found that is connected to localization and the way we work is also having staff and like that has a substantial and deep understanding of the culture of the local context, and have like that staff be involved in the piloting and designing and translating of the instruments for a substantial amount of time. Like all of those efforts that we do in the field very early on in designing those is like they have like large returns in terms of how good the quality of the data that we can collect is.
Thank you so much. So in terms of learning through my career, I think what I find helpful is, let's say I've been in this field for 10 years, is just to observe the discourses and the narratives, right? And how, for example, like the latest effort, let's say, towards localization is nothing new. It's just the latest effort, right? So things are somewhat repetitive and there are cycles, right? Similarly for, what was it called earlier? Linking rehabilitation and development. And now we talk about the nexus. But it's just like to take a step back and recognize, how dynamics that are quite similar, are described with different words, but essentially they're quite similar. So it's, because that helps you then go back and rediscover lessons that we had learned and perhaps forgotten somewhere along the way, and we can rediscover them if we have this awareness that perhaps, we're not so novel and, things are not so new, but we are sometimes rediscovering what we knew in the past and somehow we forgot. And then in terms of how we can use this learning that we're generating, the first thought that comes to my mind, and perhaps I can relate it to the community peace and development framework that I mentioned earlier, even though this is not a super rigorous tool, over time, right, it will generate learning and it will highlight certain areas that we can then further explore with more rigorous research, right? So I think, at the IRC, we are interested both in what we call learning and what we call research, right? And evidence that is generated either through rigorous research, but also in our everyday practices, from our country programs, just operational level learning. So I think, there's a relationship here between learning that's generated, through programs, as part of their M&E components, and that, over time uncover certain dynamics that could benefit from more rigorous research.
Sure.
Okay. So many of the points have been, I don't think there's anything that's been said about learning that I don't agree with already. To add some small pieces, I think that many of us write really long research papers with detailed appendices, but part of learning is making sure that learning is making it to local partners and communities that are unlikely to read our beautiful working paper with all of its tables, and thinking about making sure we prioritize which is often difficult, finding the time to produce short documents that are easily digested and that can be shared without, a table in front of you. So that's one item. But another for me is finding this balance between localization and generalizability. And this speaks to, what are we trying to learn and who is trying to learn? Are we trying to learn in general about programming targeting social cohesion as an outcome? Are we trying to look at other peace-building programming and the impacts it may have on social cohesion? Are we trying to help local communities understand conflict dynamics and reconciliation in their communities? So thinking at the beginning of the project, when you're always rushed, about your theory of change in detail, your indicators, who is actually going to use them, can help to improve the quality of your work, and certainly has helped me over the years as I look back on some surveys that I have designed with many questions that later I looked at and thought, I don't want to analyze this, and neither does anyone else. Why is it here? What were we thinking? Everybody has these questions in their surveys, or maybe just me. I think we all have these questions. So really thinking hard and remembering those bad questions and those bad indicators that didn't work, and sharing with other people so they don't make the same mistake that you did.
Thanks, Shana. Again, Pamina, I just want to give you a chance before opening up for discussion, perhaps more technical questions. But you're known for many things, but one is leading one of the most innovative approaches of the last 10 years or so. And feel free to sidestep this direct question. But Jessica brought it in at the start. It's her fault. But she mentioned the F word, failure, which I'm always interested in, in the context of learning. So given, your innovative efforts over the years working with the team, is this something you talk about? Is this something that you've experienced? If I heard you correctly, Shana? You didn't say the word, but is this something you've experienced? Has it been helpful to drive your innovative approach? So feel free to sidestep that one. Or more generally, how important learning has been for you and the development of EPI.
Thanks for that difficult question. I think failure and reflecting on failure is absolutely critical to learning. I absolutely agree with Jessica, I think that we need to think about failure more broadly, right? Not just in terms of impact evaluations, but also in terms of how we approach peace building and what the maybe institutional limitations may be in applying programs that are designed in capital cities or in the global north in local contexts. So I think we need to reflect on failure, but sometimes when we reflect on failure, we really think maybe too myopically and need to think a little bit more about, what is the context in which we're functioning when we're trying to apply programming and what may be beyond just, I don't know if it's a dialogue in a context and whether or not that is effective for social cohesion purposes. It may be that we're not adapting well because our administrative and financial teams are not willing to change programming because donors are too strict in or too difficult to adjust. So I think it can be a variety of different reasons that may be beyond just a specific impact evaluation. I made some notes about my own reflections about learning. Learning is what I do. I'm a professor, I'm a researcher. So learning can mean so many different things, and I've learned so much. I co-created Everyday Peace Indicators in 2011 with my colleague, Roger McGinty, and we spent years just reiterating the methodology to get it to a point where, you know, it was rigorous and really solid. And it's only really recently that we've been able to use it to say substantial things about theory and evaluation, and really use it as a applied methodology to engage the questions that we ask in this field, and to be able to do so in a systematic manner, but one that is still locally relevant. So it's hard for me, I guess, to answer your question, because there are so many things that I can think of in terms of learning. But one of the things I think that I've really seen, that I've really learned, is that the take-up of the information, no matter how rigorous our studies are, how solid they are people in the Global South really going to listen if we are always sitting in capital cities in the Global North, doing studies maybe with teams that are based in these locations, or with enumerators or researchers who are local, but without necessarily having Global South researchers taking the lead on the decision making behind the metrics that we use. I wonder how much uptake we really will have in terms of thinking about the resonance of the research that we do related, and the evaluations that we do related to social cohesion. And I guess as a related learning, piece of learning, I think, again, rigorous research is important, but what I've seen is that sometimes anecdotes and narratives, or even just experiences, can really be so much more powerful to really understand what we're talking about and the issues that are important to everyday people. And I think that goes for both sides of the coin, right? I mean, there's research that's been done that looks at citizens of donor countries, and whether they respond more to impact evaluations and quantitative statistics, or qualitative work, or anecdotes, and it finds that they respond more to anecdotes, and they respond more positively to anecdotes. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. I think obviously rigorous research is important. We want to know that whether or not our programming is effective. But I think it's also important to remember that there is that we need to be able to communicate that effectively in a way that it has has resonance with policymakers and with everyday citizens in the communities that we serve, as well as the communities that are giving the money.
Thanks, Pamina. So we have 30 minutes for questions. I think there's some questions already.
Sure. I'm going to prompt Chris to ask his question, who turned on his video online. Chris, go ahead.
Hi everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. I have a question to Pamina as well, and the concept of participatory indicators. Thank you very much. It's like really something that I would like to consider maybe. I'm just wondering, to what extent do all the communities that we might be working with also need to participate in creating these indicators? Because I can explain it right now. We are at the beginning of our project, and we are now at the stage where we can start to develop indicators soon, and we could also include like communities we might be working with. But like later on in the project, there might also be at later stages new communities coming, and I'm just currently wondering if I understand that like this participative creating of indicators is really a good approach to localize maybe approaches of social cohesion in the context. But I'm wondering if whenever we include new communities, these also need to go through the same process, or is it enough once we have like the local understanding that we also share those indicators with them, or do they all need to participate in that? Thank you very much.
Should I go ahead and respond, or do you want to take more questions?
There's quite a lot in that question, and it was directed to you, Pamina, but of course other panelists can weigh in afterwards. So I think for this one, let's start with this question, and then we'll open up for kind of groups of questions. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So generally, yes. I mean, we do this, at the village level, and our indicators are created for that village or that neighborhood. Generally speaking, it is very local and localized. That said, we do code our indicators. I know there was a lot of discussion earlier about comparison and whether it's possible, and there's the whole question about the tension between generalizability, universality, and then localized indicators, and whether it's possible to do both, right? And I think that we try to address this in a variety of different ways. So to answer your question specifically, it depends on the purpose of the measurement, right? If what we're doing is we're trying to guide programming at that community level, generally speaking, we collect indicators at the community and then give recommendations at the community level. And so each community is unique. Of course, it's impossible to do it in so many different communities if you're working countrywide. So what we do is we code indicators into categories, and that allows us to then compare across contexts, but also to say things like, for example, I don't know, as certain communities have certain experiences of conflict, right? So their measures of social cohesion are related to those experiences of conflict. I mean, we've seen in research that that conflict in civil wars, right? Conflict experiences are very different at the local level. So we can see also when it comes to looking at social cohesion and peace building and peace, that there's the same kind of variability, right, across contexts. But there's also there's trends that you can establish depending on the variables and that are involved in selecting those communities. And so we can say, for example, that there are certain indicators that are relevant for certain kinds of attributes of a certain community, right? So even though the indicators are not necessarily transferable, you can't transfer them from one community to the next, you can still make some inferences based on those variables. You can still compare across contexts, and you can also scale, right? So we have a project where we're working with an indigenous group in Colombia, the Pasto indigenous group in Nariño and Putumayo, and where they approached us to ask to scale their work. And with the generous funding of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, we were able to do that and collect indicators in 5 resguardos, which are like reservations, and then do surveys in 20 reservations in order to confirm that those indicators are relevant across where the Pastos live. And of course, you lose nuance, you lose detail, you lose the narratives of the individual communities where you're collecting the indicators. I mean, this is really what is so rich about everyday indicators, about localized indicators, is that it's, and anthropologists would kill me, but it's like a mini ethnography. And there are stories and narratives that come out of these really, really localized, specific indicators that we collect. But that nuance is lost when you scale, because even for an indigenous group across a variety of different contexts, peri-urban, rural, near mountainous areas, near oceans, near border with Ecuador, et cetera, there's a big difference in their experiences, and then of course also their experiences with conflict. So there's so many variables that when you scale, you begin to lose that nuance. I probably answered more than what you needed, but I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Pamina. And just curious, any other perspectives on this? Of course, we touched upon this. This great question goes to the heart of our session, I feel, and I just want to open it up to the panel. Any other alternative perspectives on this question, or to build on Pamina's answer?
Just to add a consideration, and this is not based on experience from implementation yet, but just to consider what would happen if we were implementing the framework in a community and there was an influx of displaced people into that community. I think its process matters, right? And so in addition to the Community Peace and Development Framework being a diagnostic tool and a measurement tool, is also an opportunity for different groups to get together and discuss, social cohesion measures and other areas of importance to development and peace outcomes in their communities, right? So, and we would try to include community representatives from different groups, leaders, CSO members, youth, women, right? And so there is a new specific group joining the community. I think it will be important, yes, to include them in an iteration of this workshop where the indicators are discussed and scored. But that's an opinion, right? I think this is something that we would consider if we were faced with this scenario, because as with any other participatory research methodology or qualitative methodology, one of the tricks is, one of the challenges is figure out who is to participate, right? Who is included in the research, right? And so when approaching that, we always start from a do no harm and conflict sensitive perspective. And from that perspective, I think it would be important to include, let's say, a group of newcomers into these discussions.
Unless there's any other responses to the first question, open up to all of you here in the room or online for questions for our panelists.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been really thought-provoking, and I just have a couple of questions. The first is, I'm curious. I feel like myself, I'm at Mercy Corps, and many of us are most comfortable when we're talking about really going deep in, specific small communities or easily defined communities and measuring changes in social cohesion there. But do you have any lessons or experience drawn from how to measure change and attribution, which is always difficult, on a wider scale? So changes in social cohesion as a result of policy changes at a national level, or as a result of kind of other dynamics that are going on. That's a genuine question. I don't know how I would answer it. Not supposed to be a gotcha question. And the other question is, I also am curious if there are specific challenges when we're talking about looking at the impact of others, that's related, the impact of other sector initiatives on social cohesion. So I think we've talked some about the impact of social cohesion on other development outcomes, but I'm curious about the reverse and if that presents specific measurement challenges or even just sort of challenges in terms of ways of working with people who are kind of deep in those other sectors. Over.
Great. So if I heard you correctly, great questions. One looking at a broader scale, and you give the example of a policy and how do you measure that. The second one looking at the interdependence or interrelationship between other sector initiatives and social cohesion. Feel free to take both questions at once, or of course break them up, but over to the panel on the first question, maybe on how to measure that sort of broader change.
So thank you for these questions. Both of them are super interesting to me. In terms of the measuring the impact of like a policy change, you know, this is difficult across the board. It's not just because you're used to working in more micro contexts. I think it's always difficult, you know, from just a causal analysis perspective, if everything changes, you know, to imagine the policy changes alone is difficult. I think that there are opportunities to look at how a policy change, for example, affects attitudes and affects social norms. For example, a policy change around refugee settlement, you know, opportunities for employment outside of camps could create, you know, real changes in public opinion, even in places where there are no refugees settled, for example. So there are big, you know, opinion surveys as one option on that front, although I don't know that it's always the most compelling. Sometimes popular broad support for policy change is of a great deal of interest, because if you can show, for example, popular support for a policy change, then it can be easier to push for more similar changes, for example. That might be a reason that you really wanted to test that. We all really want to know the causal impact of major policy shifts, but it is very difficult to imagine that nothing else is moving in a lot of cases, particularly for really big policies. Do you want me to pass on for this first question, or should I answer the second?
You've got the mic.
All right. Briefly, in terms of other development interventions and their impact on social cohesion, I think this is one of the times when, before bringing in questions of impacts on social cohesion, you really want to sit down and look at the theory of change, because a theory of change for a project is probably written, hopefully written, around the outcomes that they were most interested in changing. So if it's, you know, the World Food Program, they're looking at, you know, nutrition, caloric intake, that sort of thing, food security. You might need to go back and create a theory of change around the outcome that you are interested in social cohesion, and think through, before I spend time measuring social cohesion, how do I think this could have impacted it? Like, what theoretically is the potential pathway? And I think that involves a lot of local research and not just sort of jumping in and making a best guess at it. But I do think it's important to look at impacts on social cohesion of interventions that weren't thinking about social cohesion in the first place. In fact, that might be one of the most important cases. You can imagine all sorts of distributional challenges. Anyway, I will let others respond.
Great, thank you. From the standpoint of quantitative research, I guess that which is my expertise, one point that I'd like to make about, you know, what happens when we go to scale, when we want to look at something that's going on a national scale, for example, in terms of like a development program and an intervention. I would guess that like the number one thing to bear in mind is the composition of the sample that you're drawing your information from. And first, making sure that there is, you know, geographic representation generally tends to correlate with also ethnicities, or as like some ethnicities will like geographically cluster, but also, you know, connected to the theory of change, which characteristics of the people that we are interested in learning about, which characteristic will be the most important in our mind as we're designing a program in affecting the impacts. It's possible that, you know, if my program is an agricultural intervention that is providing one of the biggest components of my program, for example, is providing seeds, and then I want to look at what's the impact of that program here, abstracting for a second from social cohesion, then of course as I scale up the program, maybe I'm interested in learning what happens differently if you're looking at a population that's tangential, that's agricultural, that's based, versus a population that's moving. And so this was just like a very a simple example of how the composition of the sample that you are drawing information from is crucial for the conclusions that you're going to draw. So that's one thing. And then the second, if I understand the second question correctly, about like which other how do we think about the impact of other sectors and initiatives? I feel that is a pointer in the direction of rigorous impact evaluations and building our studies in a way that they rely on a strong counterfactual. And this is because, what we call, either randomized control trials or researcher-led experiments or natural experiments happen, what we call natural experiments, they occur in many instances. For example, program eligibility sometimes is conditional on a score. And then we can think about the people that are just above the score or people that are just below the score to be eligible for a program are generally, we can think of them as being comparable populations. And so within this aspect, I think your question is definitely a big sort of, is a big point to build and say, that's why we're interested in building counterfactuals, because the counterfactual is exposed to everything else that the population has, minus the specific program that we're looking at. And that's the comparison that we want, because confounding factors are definitely there. Programs happen, especially if we think about, populations that are in poverty pockets. There's a lot of actors working with those communities, and we definitely want to know what's the impact of the program at hand.
I'm itching to say this. It's not super related, somewhat, right, to your question about policy, right, and policy change and what influence that might have on social cohesion. What I want to say, it relates, because I think at the core of that is a question of scale, right? How do we move, what is the relationship between this really localized dynamics and microdynamics and meso and macro level dynamics, right? And just a point I want to make in this regard is, even if we focus on the understanding of micro-level dynamics, and this is an observation that's coming from the research that I mentioned earlier, right? When we looked at dynamics between host and displaced communities in urban areas, and as they relate to natural resources and their management. And I said, we didn't really see any instances of violent intergroup-based conflict. One of the things that we did not observe, for example, was the existence of narratives, right? That these localized conflicts could be, or grievances or tensions could be attached to, right? Unlike some of what was mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, and I think it was in relation to Turkey and Syrian refugees in Turkey, where local right-wing parties were able to exploit those grievances, for their political agendas. So I think, I don't know, maybe this is coming up it will be coming up in one of the next sessions, but this question of scale, and the relationship between micro and macro dynamics is quite interesting. And I don't necessarily have the answers, but this is what we hypothesized, that we also did not see these violent conflicts because simply there was no interest yet in exploiting those local grievances. There were no, let's say, conflict entrepreneurs acting on those grievances. So yeah, that doesn't necessarily relate to policy, but it does speak to this relationship between different scales. So.
Any other comments? Pamina, would you like to respond to either question that was asked?
I can't quite hear you, but I'm assuming you're asking me if I have a response.
Yeah, to either question or both of them that was just asked.
Yeah. So I'm going to also kind of skirt this a little bit like Katja. So, I mean, to the first question, I think, so one thing that we've seen that's really fascinating is that, of course, just like with expert-driven indicators, community-driven indicators change over time. And these changes are in response to, I don't know, I mean, this question of, you know, the causality or the link related to policy is one that I can't respond to. But what is fascinating is looking at indicators after there have been big shocks. So I'll give you one example. We're working in Sri Lanka with USIP, and we're working all across the country in the north, central, and south. We collected our first round of indicators in 2018. And since then, there's been a coup, there's been a terrorist attack, there's been a global pandemic. Rightly so, all of our partners are asking, are these indicators still relevant? And what's been really interesting now that we've returned and collected indicators again, is that we do see a shift. And we see that shift related to, in particular, some of the more recent dynamics, political dynamics. For those of you who follow Sri Lanka, there's been a lot of political turmoil, political and economic turmoil, and in recent months. And it just happened to be that at that time we were collecting indicators, which is amazing, and real kudos to our team considering the energy crisis there. But we were able to travel across the country and collect indicators, and you can see a shift. And I'm going to give you a very specific example. So in the South, we saw a lot of indicators of reconciliation that were offensive, really. So you had Sinhalese who, you know, everyday Sinhalese who bought into the narrative that they had won the war, and so therefore deserved certain kinds of rights over Tamils and Muslims. So we saw indicators like, for example, when I get on the municipal bus, a Tamil and Muslim offers me their seat. And those kinds of indicators we don't see anymore. We don't see anymore this kind of really offensive, and I mean, at least to me, offensive, right? Understanding of what reconciliation means. And that shift has happened in part because of the political changes in the country. So we can see shifts within the indicators over time when we go back and collect indicators and compare what we saw prior to what we see now. And then in terms of your second question about impact of other sectors, I mean, I'm going to skirt it a little bit. But I mean, you know, this really speaks to the paper that I presented at the beginning in my opening remarks, because other sectors are part of this sector. They are very much tied into the peace building sector, right? Peace building is very, very malleable, right? There is not one concrete peace building sector. And so you see a human rights sector, security sector, development sector. I mean, all the different sectors that kind of push and pull and jostle their space within the peace building arena. And you see that jostling happening through measurement. And you can see that when you analyze the measurement metrics that different organizations within the sectors use to measure, because they approach peace building either from an economic development perspective, from a security perspective, from a human rights perspective, right? So you see this jostling happening, and you can really see that through measurement, and that is essentially the kind of competition that's happening, right? Of the different kinds of actors from different sectors that are in the peace building space.
Great. Wow, so much there. Sort of taking me back to my original question on learning, where as I listen to you all, we often talk about one of the biggest challenges is between, bridging the gaps between, sort of evidence and practice. But as I listened to you earlier, I mean, two things. One was clearly a lot has happened in terms of bridging divides, if you like, among sectors rather than between evidence and practice. But just listening to you, Pamina, there, and you used the word jostling several times, clearly there's a lot more there. It was one of the things I was thinking about when we think about the frontiers and what lies ahead of us. Is it, and of course the easy answer is both, but is it about being better at evidence to practice, or is it about sort of sharing evidence and learning across the sort of the evidence, the knowledge builders, if you like? Anyway, I think maybe time for one more question, do we? Yeah, if there's another last one lurking out there. Yeah. Several short ones. Yes.
I have a question for everybody, but maybe Shana first. You talked about how sometimes we assume that attitudes change, then behavior change, and that may not be the case. And I think this is a really important point and relates to how we think about ideology, for instance, or what we heard about Nigeria. I was wondering if in the panel you had examples of cases where attitude and behavior did not go in the same direction, or there were some surprises there that you could share.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
So related to that, also just curious of your take of with seeing attitudes maybe move after behaviors, how much of that you think has to do with the potential self-reporting bias that comes from attitudinal measures versus behavioral measures that are more observational and ways of kind of getting around that challenge?
Okay, so a couple of things here. So first, the concept that behaviors move first and then attitudes can shift is sort of well studied in social psychology, which is probably not the background of most people in this room, certainly isn't mine. But this is something that I initially dug deeper into when indeed in my own work with Alex Skako in northern Nigeria, we found in our study that attitudes pretty well didn't move, but some behavior through behavioral games moved quite a bit. And we were beginning to think through, how can this be? And there is a lot of evidence that, your attitudes are formed through a lifetime. And you can change your behavior. You might feel the same way, but you can change your behavior in response to perceived social norms about what is the appropriate way to behave, even if you don't feel that way. And as I say this reminds me, it's like when you talk to, a child about say you're sorry. You don't have to be sorry. You bumped into somebody on the street, you just say you're sorry. But over time, you hopefully, as a child, mature and actually are sorry that you bumped into somebody. But this fits into sort of a general behavioral phenomenon where you adapt a norm of behavior as you see yourself and others acting in this way. Your attitudes may shift to align with your behaviors. That is one school of social psychology thought on this. The other is in the other direction, that your behaviors are a reflection of your attitudes. But there is evidence in many domains well outside of social cohesion that behavior and social norms can move before attitude change. In terms of the question on self-reporting, I think that's always difficult, and it's one of the challenges as well in asking a follow-up round. The more you ask people about these things, the more they realize what you're really asking and what the right answer actually is, which of course sits counter to the frequent measuring, because some items people adjust to what the right answer is, especially people who've been to like a peace education workshop repeatedly. You know, there are choices to be made there. So I think that this is a really challenging one to figure out about attitudes moving later. And in some ways, you can't keep surveying the same people on the same attitude question when it's clear what you're looking for. It may be a choice, for example, to save some of your sample if you have the budget and sample size, to only ask them later and not ask at the beginning. It's like the choice that many of us make about, you know, what questions are in your baseline and what do you hold out on because you think your baseline will mess with your end line. And I'm going to leave that there because we're at the end of time. Does anybody else?
Okay. Great. Well, end of time, great, 2:45. So thanks to, first of all, our panel speakers for sharing with us their insights, and to all of you for your questions. And I think we're heading into a break.
Yes, we're heading into our last break of the day, so do everything you need to do now, because we're going to reconvene at 3 p.m. for a roundtable on filling